As you see, this is Handsy Brandt. That's the woman that that I was gonna speak about. And the title of the things that I'm going to talk about is Testifying Before Men, Testifying Before a Woman, the case of Handsy Brandt. And I will start the story in the 50s. In the 1950s, the Israeli public first heard about a woman whose personal Holocaust story was very different from other stories about the Holocaust told in Israel until then. She told her story in first person. When she described her actions as a member of the Aid and Rescue Committee, ועדת העזרה וההצלה, in Budapest, and her own part in rescue operation of Jews, she often felt that an explanation, sometimes an apology, was required. She spent the war years in Budapest, a married woman with 2 small sons. After the war, she moved to Israel. In 1964, she lost her husband. One of her sons died at a young age. She never remarried and stayed in her small apartment in Tel Aviv, and she died aged 88. Hansi Brandt told her story in public several times. She appeared as a witness at an Israeli district court where she was examined and cross-examined twice. She also published a book and was interviewed by the press. During the war, as a member of ועדת העזרה וההצלה, Hansi Brandt was involved in providing aid to Jewish refugees who came to Budapest from other countries. After the occupation in March 1944, she joined Dr. Rudolf Kastner, Israel Kastner, and her husband, Yoel Brandt, both senior members of the committee, in negotiations held with German officials in an attempt to stop the transport to the death camps. The most senior of these German officials was Adolf Eichmann. Their efforts to rescue Jews stood in the eye of a public storm that broke out during the liberal trial against Malkiel Greenwald. This trial is known in Israel as the Kastner trial or the Greenwald-Kastner trial. In the 1950s, the trial caused a political upheaval, and the judge stated that Kastner had sold his soul to the devil. 7 years later, the devil, Adolf Eichmann, stood trial in Jerusalem. Hansi Brandt was a witness in both trials. Hansi Brandt was born in 1912 in Budapest to a middle-class Zionist family. After graduating trade school, she began working in the family's knitting workshop. In her youth, she became a member of a Jewish youth movement, preparing herself to make Aliyah to Palestine. It was there when she met Yoel Brandt. They married in 1935, and in March 1944, the Brandt children were 6 and 4. During the war, Hansi Brandt arranged papers for Jews who arrived from Poland and Slovakia, and later also for local Jews. She had an important role in the work of ועדת העזרה וההצלה, although formally she was never a full member of the committee, and she was regarded as a wife of one of its senior members, Yoel Brandt. The committee's negotiations with the Germans reached to their peak with the Blood for Goods deal, 1 million Jews for 10,000 trucks, for which Eichmann sent Yoel Brandt to Istanbul. Once he left Budapest, Hansi Brandt went on negotiating with Eichmann, sometimes by herself. She was also involved in putting together the list of passengers for the train later to be known in Israel as the Kastner train, and she was the one who brought Kastner and Eichmann together. She met with Eichmann at least 10 times and faced him fearlessly. The trial against Malkiel Greenwald opened in Jerusalem at the Jerusalem District Court in January 1st, 1954. It triggered a political storm around the issue of the conduct of the Yeshuv leadership, later the state leadership, in the face of the Holocaust. Formally, this was a liberal trial. In actual fact, it provided a stage for a broad public debate regarding the way of the Jews in Europe should have reacted at the time of the Holocaust, and also an attack to Mapai, the party in power at that time. Other than Hansi Brandt, the leading figures of Kastner's affair were all men. Kastner, Greenwald, Yoel Brand, Judge Benjamin Halevi, defense attorney Shmuel Tamir, a prosecutor Amnon Tel, and then the Attorney General Chaim Cohen. Kastner's wife, Elizabeth Bodio Kastner, was hardly mentioned in the papers. Hansi Bond was not in the limelight. In reports and articles that dealt with the affair, she was anything but prominent and sometimes was not even mentioned. Most of the time, the newspapers mentioned her in connection with men, sometimes not even mentioning her first name. She was Yoel Brandt's wife, Kastner's right-hand woman. Although she was an active member of the committee and met with Eichmann, her part was blurred. Generally speaking, her role was not considered important. The fact that she was a woman helped introduce her as a secondary assistant, or as we can say, Ezer Kenegdo. The reports about Hansi Brandt's testimony at the Greenwald trial highlighted qualities that were traditionally attributed to women. She testifying, holding back her tears, and appeared a little bit scared. These descriptions matched the tone reports that described signs of weakness in Kastner, who broke into tears once in court. Although the Eichmann trial was very different from the Greenwald-Kastner trial, no significant differences were noticed in Hansi Brandt's place in the public discourse. In the Eichmann trial as well, she mentioned in common with a man, usually Yoel Brandt. Yoel Brandt's testimony, in which he described his mission in Istanbul and submitted new documents to the court, won great attention than her testimony. In the records of the testimonies, she was mentioned as Brandt's wife, who completed her husband's story. In the verdict, the judges also referred to her as Brandt's wife. Hansi Bond was also the only woman among the witnesses that met with Eichmann, and among the few witnesses who were cross-examined by the defense attorney, Dr. Robert Servatius. Her testimony continued over 2 sessions. In the first, she was examined by the defense attorney, Gavriel Bach, and by the president of the court. In the second, which continued on the next day, she was examined by Judge Yitzhak Raveh and by Judge Benjamin Halevi. In court, she spoke in calm and confident voice, which stood in contrast to the voice of her emotional husband, who raised his voice from time to time as he was testifying. One of the judges even commented, "Mr. Brandt, perhaps you can answer briefly to the point. Remember the example of your wife gave by speaking calmly." While she was giving her testimony at the Eichmann trial, Hansi Brandt, she felt that she had to explain her moves and actions, both her personal ones and those she was involved in at the committee. At the time, she was not fluent in Hebrew. The available documents and reports indicate that she began her testimony in the Eichmann trial in Hebrew and switched to German early on. From time to time, she requested to add a few words of clarification, and the president of the court, Supreme Court Judge Moshe Landoy, always gave her permission to do so. However, she clearly intended, among other things, to point out how completely helpless she and the committee were, especially in the contacts with Eichmann. By this, she was trying to soften her image as a collaborator. Hansi Bond was appreciated only to the extent to which her story matched the values accepted by society at the time. Even when she left a positive impression in court, her story was rephrased to match those values. It was expressed in 2 ways, as a fighter and as a mother. Armed resistance was not part of her story. In 1944 Budapest, an armed uprising was not possible. In spite of this, several journalists in Israel described her as underground fighter, in charge of the contact between Yoel Brandt and Eichmann, so-called kasharit, a title borrowed from the armed underground fighters in the ghettos. To generate respect for Hansi Brandt, the press stressed that the actions she carried out and the qualities she displayed were those traditionally attributed to women. One of the reporters was practically impressed with the strength that she faced when she faced Eichmann when it came to saving children. The reporter saw her as a brave woman who was ready to sacrifice her life to save children, but by that she was demonstrating motherly feelings, a quality that was regarded as the calling of women. On the other hand, there were no real interest in her experience as a mother during the Holocaust. Similar to Grünwald-Kastner trial, the Eichmann trial was also handled by men. To them, motherhood such as this wasn't relevant. In 1960, the book The Satan and the Soul, Satan והנפש, that she wrote with Yoel Band was published by a private public house. Although they appear on the cover as co-authors, their voices were distinctive. Hansy's name is brought at the beginning and at the end of every section she wrote to distinguish her words from those of Yoel Band. This may also be regarded as symbolic. Here too the man is the default and there is no need to specify his name. Although both their names appear on the cover, the press used to mention Yoel Band as a soul writer. The initial reviews mentioned in passing that the book was written by Yoel Band and his wife, Hansi. She was never mentioned in the headline, not even in the subtitles. Leisha, journalist, Bruria Avidan, which was a woman, was the only one who was interested in Hansi Brandt as individual. The Israeli popular women magazine Leisha was the only one that dedicated a broad article about Hansi Brandt in 1960. It was the only personal interview Hansi Brandt gave at that time. Its value as a historical source lies not only because it was unique, but also in the content of the story it brought, which was told freely in first person. The interview was held such as intimate women's chat. The reporter addressed Hansi Brandt by her first name, asked her about her family life, and described her work with children at the time as a way to carry on her life after the Holocaust. The interview described Hansi Brandt two functions, her public official one and her private family one. Brandt described her formal function by herself. I was a member of the Aid and Rescue Committee since my husband's departure for Istanbul until the liberation, she said. Her family role, mother of two children and a wife of a man Eichmann has chosen and sent to this crucial mission, was woven into the entire interview. This way, the interview succeeded in telling the story of the Holocaust in Budapest through the story of one woman, the mother of Michael and Daniel, while also bringing reflections of the Grünwald-Kastner trial. She shared her emotions with the reporter and told her frankly about the crying and most of all, the fear. And fear was not taken as a sign of weakness, almost the contrary. The reporter expressed great appreciation for Hansi Brandt. Although she was scared, she noted, this woman showed her true mental and physical strength whenever courage was required. Leisha, a women's magazine, thought it is important to deal with the fact that Brandt was a mother during the Holocaust. No other newspapers or journals found this issue important and interesting. Her family status was only mentioned in the connection of her husband and not her children. In her interview to Leisha, Hansi Brandt spoke her mind, and I must say, as always. Israelis don't believe us, she said. They don't believe that in 1944 it was impossible to take arms in Budapest and it was necessary to use the traditional way of Jews in Europe: appeal, avoid, outsmart, and pay lots of money. I had never taken a course that taught me how to save Jews, she added. I had never learned in school how to negotiate with a man such as Eichmann. History, she said in 1960, will judge who was right. A central part of the interview was devoted to a family life during and after the Holocaust, and task that was traditionally regarded as women's tasks. Although the article was meant to promote the book, The Satan and the Soul, it seems as if going public was very difficult for Hansi Brandt. At the beginning of the interview, she told the journalist that she would rather not to speak. Not because her Hebrew was not good enough, and not because she was ashamed what she has done, but because she realized that in 1960, the Israeli public was not ready to deal with her Holocaust story. At the time, she was driving to make herself heard. In this sense, Leisha, both as a women's magazine and as a magazine that was not linked to a movement or a party, was almost an ideal place. The journalist who came to interview her did not judge her, but simply let her talk, permitted showing emotions without having them tagged as weakness, and telling Holocaust experience as a family story. In summary, even though there are differences between the testimonies Hansi Brandt gave in court and in the interview she gave to Leisha, both demonstrate that she had remained in the margins of the public discourse in spite of the central role she played in Budapest. Her story shows that testifying before a man was one story, and testifying before a woman was another story. Whatever appreciation there was for Hansi Brandt, it fed on social accepted values. Whenever her feminine side was emphasized, she was regarded with approval. During the Grünwald-Kastner trial, emphasizes the place of her emotional behavior. In the Eichmann trial, her commitment to protect children was pointed out. In both cases, she was introduced as a helper. During the Kastner trial, she was mentioned as opposite of the Ghetto Fighters. In the Eichmann trial, the terminology linked with armed resistance was used to describe her. In both cases, the Israeli press described her as a strong woman, but she was always mentioned as a wife and not as a personality of her own. In her interview to Leisha, Hansi Bond spoke frankly and openly, sometimes with a hint of irony. The only place where she was given a chance to speak freely was a woman's magazine. The statements she made in the 1960s about the changing perceptions of the Holocaust in Israeli society were extremely premature. They were made before the events later defined by the researchers as the turning points in the Israeli public's perceptions of the Holocaust, including the Eichmann trial. At the time they were made, few Holocaust survivors used this kind of rhetoric in their public statements. And that is another proof of the value of feminine sources in historical research that sometimes was mentioned in the last session. Not only that they expose her story, but also they enrich the history or the histories in general. Thank you.